This show has focused so far on Tibetan teachings on death and rebirth, but there are also Western authors who have been thinking and writing about transitions and have their own model to offer. In this episode, I'll share 4 of my Western favorites, their 3-stage model of transitions, and some of the recent research on how people go through transitions in this lifetime. At the end of the day, these authors make a great conversation partner, so to speak, with Tibetan teachings on literal rebirth. Welcome to Letting Grow, the podcast about one of the spiritual journey's most difficult and courageous moments, letting go of who we think we should be so we can grow into who we most deeply are. I'm your host, Claire Villarreal, and I appreciate your joining me today. Greetings, friends. On this podcast, I have talked a lot about Tibetan teachings on the death and rebirth process, literally, but also interpreted metaphorically. And I wanted this week to bring you something a little bit different. It is a Western view of transitions. So obviously, there's not necessarily, at the moment, a strong Western tradition of talking about literal reincarnation. And it seems like often people have a hard time even talking about like rebirth and metaphorical transitions without getting all uncomfortable about the death part. So I wanted to bring you an overview of some of the main authors I have found on transitions in the modern West. And I don't know whether this is because I am coming from an academic background or whether this work just comes out of academia, but a lot of what I've found is really based in the academic study of so-called other cultures. So like non-Western, more traditional cultures. If you're familiar with this acronym WEIRD for referring to Western cultures, the W is for Western, E is for educated, I is for industrialized, R is for rich, and D is for democratic. And there's been, a lot of recognition more recently about how atypical our views really are if we have grown up in a culture like that. Most of human cultures, for most of human existence, do not see the world the way that we see it. And, I'm coming from a background in religious studies, and obviously there's a huge difference between like the very secular mindset that a lot of us have and a more traditional religiously oriented or religiously based mindset that people have coming from a lot of these like non-weird cultures. So I want to talk to you today about 4 different authors, and one of the things that's really striking to me is that even the 2 most modern authors really are working off the writings of the 2 earlier ones, starting with Arnold van Gennep in the early 1900s. So I'm presenting this stuff not just because it's like academically interesting, I'm going to drag you through the boring stuff before we get to the good stuff, but because I think there's kind of an intellectual lineage here of people thinking about transitions, thinking about how we go through them, and in a lot of cases noticing that modern Western cultures don't actually really have great models or great like rituals to help people go through times of transition. So having given that kind of introduction to the topic for today, I wanted to say that in general, these Western authors share a model of transitions that has 3 stages. There's an ending, an in-between space, and a beginning. And if you've been listening into earlier episodes, you'll know that in the Tibetan description of the death and rebirth process, there's 4 stages. There's the life we have where we're in now, then there's the death process, the in-between state, and rebirth. So it's very similar, but I think it's kind of significant that in the Western writings on transition, there's not a lot of attention paid to where we are now. And I think that's mostly because it's not taking into account that we can practice and train and cultivate our minds before we go through transitions. So before I start describing these books, I just want to say that the names of the books and the authors will all be in the show notes. So if you want to look something up or you want to actually read one of these books, you'll be able to find that in the notes. So don't worry about having to write all this stuff down. So the first book I want to talk about is by Arnold van Gennep, and it's called Rites of Passage. It's translated from the French, and one book I read on this book actually says that Rites of Transition might be a more appropriate title for this book, and it definitely seems to be kind of like the source that gets everyone else thinking about transitions in this Western lineage that I'm talking about. So it's kind of foundational. There's obviously pre-modern and ancient and, classical thought about transitions too. And for instance, in, ancient Greece, there was a lot of belief in and interest in reincarnation, like in a literal sense. So obviously this is a modern Western look at it, but this early 1900s book is a pretty good place to start. So as the title suggests, this book is all about rites of passage. And what is a rite of passage? Like, it's basically a time that marks a person's transition from one role in a community to another. So there could be a rite of passage around adulthood. There could be a rite of passage around becoming a parent, around what we might call retirement, definitely around the death process, definitely around the birth process. So these rituals around each of these rites of passage, which are themselves rituals, are ways to help people in a community become someone different. So to help a child become an adult, to help everyone recognize this person's new status as an adult. And in a lot of the societies that Van Gennep was talking about, and the next author too, that we'll talk about, the transition from one stage of life to the next can be really important, and there can be kind of magical abilities or duties or just capabilities that are different depending on what stage of life you're in. So it's really helpful and important to have these kinds of rituals to mark those stages. So for instance, the type of ritual that Van Gennep is writing about and that the next author, Victor Turner, will also write about might be one in which someone is going from being a child to being an adult. And when they come to a certain age, when maybe there's a group of kids who are all ready to be initiated into adulthood, those kids would be taken from the village and there would be like a special hut or a special place for them to be kind of like sequestered away for this in-between time, because they're no longer children, but they're not adults yet. And in that place, like elders might teach them the ways of adults. They might be initiated into magical societies. They might learn a different language, literally or metaphorically. And sometimes there's even a ritual enactment of death, burial, and then rebirth at the end of this, like, in-between space. And after the kids in this example that I'm giving have gone through this in-between state, they would then be kind of ritually reborn into the society. And some cultures even have expectations for those people coming out of those rituals that they'll take a little while to kind of reincorporate themselves into society. And it's really a significant way for people to experience, both for themselves and for the community to experience, that they have changed from who they were to who they are now. And one last note about Van Gennep. He really tends to write about these transitions or rites of passage in terms of geography. So crossing boundaries or being separated from the village and coming back. And by the time we get to later authors, that's more of an internalized journey. But I just find it interesting that in this first author out of this series of Western authors, there's a very strong spatial element to a transition. There's a boundary, you cross it. The boundary might be the boundary of the village, and you leave the village to have this transitional or in-between experience, and then you come back. But there's definitely, typically, in what Van Gennep is writing about, there's an element of kind of separation and return. The next author that I want to talk about is Victor Turner, and the book I'm discussing here is The Ritual Process. And Victor Turner was writing in English and writing at the end of the 1960s. I think this book was published in 1969. So a very different cultural moment from the early 1900s, In that time, there was sort of this, sense of Europe as dominant. They hadn't had World War I yet. There was, I think, less maybe interest in emulating some of these rituals from so-called other cultures. And one thing also that I find interesting about Victor Turner is that even though he did field work in Africa, he also writes about the counterculture in the US, for instance. So he's really bringing the concepts closer to home. And a lot of this book, well, some of it is dedicated to African case studies, some of which are, helpful and some not so much. And a lot of this earlier scholarship doesn't necessarily hold up like super well these days. But what I'm interested in from this book, The Ritual Process, is really the time and attention that Victor Turner gives to this idea of liminal space. So if someone is going through one of these rites of passage and has been isolated from their village and then they return later, Turner is really interested in what happens when they're isolated. And he writes about people really being stripped of their identity when they enter this kind of liminal in-between space and experiencing some time without an identity, some time betwixt and between, so to speak. I think that's a phrase that Van Gennep came up with. Either that or it's in Turner's work. But it's a famous phrase referring to this liminal space. So it's in between one identity and the next. And part of what Turner writes about that I find really interesting is that in the societies he studied, there's often a certain power associated with people in that liminal state or with people in society who have a weaker position, like, for instance, one nation conquers another nation and the nation that lost is now sort of subordinate to the stronger nation, but the nation that's subordinate is believed to have almost like magical powers, that there's a certain numinous quality or a sacred quality to these people who are in between identities or to the people who don't hold the power in a society. I find that really interesting, especially if I think about the descriptions in Tibetan Buddhism of the Bardo states, beginning with the Bardo of death and then the Bardo of clear light, Bardo of becoming. There's a real sense of how clear or how permeable our ordinary sense of self is to what is sacred about us. So I find it interesting that Turner kind of touches on that a bit in his work, but he's writing as an anthropologist, he's studying religion, he's not using religious language. So I think that's a big difference between his approach to what happens in this in-between state versus like the approach of Tibetan Buddhism, where they're actively saying like this is a time to like attain the highest goals of this religious tradition and awaken to your true nature. So Victor Turner, very interesting work on the liminal space, the space in between one identity and the next. And now let's move on to some more modern authors with William Bridges, whose book Transitions, Making Sense of Life's Changes came out, I want to say in the 80s. So he's a lot more modern, but still a few decades old now. Hi friends, want to join the Letting Grow tribe? I'll be starting a bi-weekly newsletter in early 2021 with links to articles, YouTube videos, other podcasts, and basically the best of the Rebirth content I've come across lately. Some examples of the kinds of things I want to share with you include a snap judgment story about a bull who seemed to be the reincarnation of another bull, a viral article about the creepy things kids say, but some of them 100% seem to refer to previous lives, and some excerpts from the book I'm writing now about the lessons Tibetan Buddhist teachings on life and death offer to those of us going through transitions. Spoiler alert, that's all of us. Best of all, if you're subscribed, you'll get links to join free live video calls with me and other subscribers every couple of months. So pause this episode now, find the newsletter sign-up link in the show notes, and join your tribe. One thing I find really interesting about Bridges is that he used to be a literature professor, like in a college somewhere, before he actually started working exclusively, it seems, in the later years of his career on transitions, offering workshops and trainings, and he developed a whole system for applying this to business too. So he really went all the way down the transitions rabbit hole. And I think there had been work on like the midlife crisis and these other ideas around important transitional states in our life cycle, but Bridges, as far as I can tell, is the first one to really bring the idea of transitions together in a more rigorous way to offer this like 3-stage model of a transition to the rest of us. This is not being written in the context of anthropology. It's really being written more in the context, I guess you could say, of self-help or understanding our own lives. So Bridges sticks with that original sort of 3-phase description of a transitional state. So you have the ending, the in-between state, and then the new beginning. And he uses, for that in-between state, he uses the neutral zone, which does not sit right with me at all. But if you like it, that's what he calls that in-between state. Endings, the neutral zone, and new beginnings. And one thing I find really interesting about his work is that he brings in a lot of like classical Western mythology to help make his case. So a lot of Greek myths, just really good stuff. I found his writing very interesting. I also was a literature and religious studies double major as an undergraduate, so what he writes speaks to me. So obviously I'm biased in the authors I am selecting, but I think it's really interesting. If you've been interested in the Tibetan approach to the Bardo states, it's really interesting to then read how Bridges is using classical mythology as a very different lens into some pretty similar psychological territory. This book is really good. I highly recommend it. I don't want to get into it too much because this isn't really like a book review. If you're interested in hearing more about any of these books, just write me. And I can do another podcast episode and do a deeper dive on one individual book. You can find that email address in the show notes. And the final book I want to talk about today is by Bruce Feiler, and it's called Life is in the Transitions. And this one is so good, y'all. It's so good. If you're just going to read one of these books, I would recommend reading this one. This is the first book I've read that actually connects writings about transition and this sort of 3-stage model with data from people who have gone through transitions in their lives and talked to Feiler and his team of researchers about what they did during those transitional states, how they worked. It's super fascinating. There's too much stuff to go into here, but I'll just summarize and say that Feiler talks about in this book really the ways that we make sense of transitions afterwards. Like usually we've gone through them first and then we can look back and make sense and make meaning out of them. But he also will, for instance, talk about different life shapes. So, the way that people think about the course of their lives can help show us what's important to them. Whether it's a focus on achievement or a focus on community, a focus on belonging, and that often our key value that orders our lives will shift over the course of a lifetime. So in a big transition, we might find ourselves shifting from like individual achievement more to a sense of belonging or family. And I found it really helpful and really enlightening to read these descriptions and to read some of the data too. What part of a transition do people find most difficult? What types of rituals do people tend to make up? How do people know when they've left behind something that is old? How do they know when they've really stepped into something new? So there's a ton of really interesting stuff in this book and a lot of stories of people who have gone through these really incredible transitions and what they've learned from them, and then what we can learn from the ways that people have gone through these states. And finally, one last really cool thing from this book, Life is in the Transitions, is this term life quakes. So Feiler talks about different things that happen to us in our lives that force us to make a transition of some kind. But he talks about, sort of ordinary life transitions, and then what he calls life quakes. And these are the really big transitional states that kind of mark the end of one chapter of our lives and the beginning of the next. He says people tend to have 3 to 5 of these during their lifetimes, and he calls them life quakes. I love it. So a life quake could be having several different transitions layered on top of each other. Like, for instance, moving, changing jobs, and then you lose a family member in that process. So all those things together can kind of have an amplifying effect on how deep an impact that transition or those transitions taken collectively will have on you. Okay, that was a super quick tour of these 4 different authors that I have been reading and enjoying, and I'm actually working on a short book that touches on the history of the idea of transitions in Western culture and where I think they speak to Tibetan authors, but also where I think Tibetan authors speak to this Western tradition. So a few themes I want to highlight from these Western authors on transitional states. So first of all, this was something I was really struck by in each of these four authors, even though none of them is coming at this from like a specifically religious perspective. The theme of death and rebirth is very prominent, but it is never literal. So the earlier authors, Van Gennep and Turner, will talk about people in traditional cultures having rituals that depict a death and a rebirth. And even Feiler, one of the things he says is that he was really struck by the fact that so many people in his research participants talked about the transitions they had gone through as a death followed by a rebirth. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think it's part of the reason that the Tibetan teachings on literal death and rebirth have so much resonance, even for those of us who may not believe them literally, because there is this sense that we're going to go through that within this lifetime, let alone like once this lifetime ends. The next thing I want to talk about is that all of these authors in some way recognize that non-ordinary or sacred or numinous states of reality are just closer in a transition, that there's less of that ordinary barrier between ourselves and the more than the surplus of meaning that is the sacred in the world. So in Van Gennep's writing, for instance, and even in Turner's writing, there's a sense that people who are in the liminal state, the in-between state of a ritual of transition, that they are more in touch with the fundamental powers of birth and death and reality itself. They are sometimes thought to have magical abilities that no one else can have. And sometimes the people who are sort of sequestered in their sacred hut or whatever outside the village, no one else is allowed to come into contact with them, possibly because their magical powers are too great. And if someone who's not ready for that contact comes into contact with them, they could be harmed. So I just find that really interesting. That it's a way of thinking about like the sacred power, the sacred charge that someone has in this in-between state. And if you've ever lived through a really significant transition, like the loss of a loved one, or sort of that state we were all in after 9/11 happened here in the US, you can probably relate to that sense that there's a certain ordinariness of life that's been taken away and suddenly everything is possible. For better and for worse, there is a certain sense that we're just not going to be held back or bound by our ordinary limitations. So there is a sense in which it's a little more dangerous to interact with somebody when they're in that state. And one thing I was struck by in the writings of both William Bridges and Bruce Feiler is that they both mention people going through these sorts of transitions and feeling like they're getting guidance from their ancestors or their spirit guides or these other sacred or numinous or non-ordinary beings that we don't usually have access to. Neither of them really pursues that very much. And this is where I think Tibetan Buddhism really has something to offer to this whole discourse, which is a way of talking about the sacred. Just the model of the human being and the human mind that Tibetan Buddhism offers, I think it adds something really important to the Western understanding of who and what we are. It adds that at the base of our being is Buddha nature. That when you strip everything else down, it's not that there's nothing, it's that there's something luminous but beyond our ordinary mind. So I feel like that's a really important contribution that Tibetan Buddhism has to make to our Western understanding of what a transition is and what it can be. Also, I think the fact that Tibetan Buddhism focuses a lot really on the bardo of this life and preparing for these transitional states, it's really something that can turn transitions into more of a spiritual opportunity if we're aware that, the way life is now is just not the way it's always going to be, can help us to make the most and the best use of our time. And also, honestly, to understand more deeply who we are now so that when we go through a transitional state, we're not as shocked to discover that who we think we are is not exactly who we really are. And on the other hand, I think one thing that the Western lineage of writing about transitions really has to offer to the Tibetan understanding, especially for Westerners, is this sense of how you apply these teachings metaphorically, that there is a 3-stage model, and that this death and rebirth is already part of the transitions that we go through in our lifetime. So I hope this really brief tour has been a helpful way to maybe understand better where we're all coming from as Westerners, or people informed at least probably by Western cultures, where we're coming from and the sorts of assumptions that we bring to the discussion around rebirth or reincarnation. And I hope it shows the richness and the diversity of different ways of thinking about these transitions, but also that there seems to be a very basic pattern that emerges of death, an intermediate state, and rebirth, whether that's framed in academic terms, in religious terms, in psychological development terms. It just seems to keep coming up. So thank you for coming along for the ride. If you want a deeper dive into any of the topics that I talked about today, again, just email me. My email is in the show notes, and I will be super happy to do a deeper dive on any of these because I am a nerd and I would love to share this stuff with you. Thanks for coming along for today's exploration of the process of letting grow. If you found this episode helpful, please share it. And subscribe now so you're always in the loop. For links to more content related to today's episode, please see the show notes. See you again next week.